Two Babies in a Business, a podcast about business, marketing, growth strategy, staff, clients, babies, and marriage. I'm Christina. This is Peter. We're founders and leaders of CIPR Communications. And I'm excited today because we're joined by Jason Hewlett, right out of Kamloops, who is my original podcast co-host. Jason, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me back on it. After talking weekly for a year and a half, it seems like it's been a very long time since the last time we spoke.
It's true. It's funny. So listeners, Jason, I love this kind of bio you've given yourself: former journalist turned broadcaster and podcaster, plus a whole bunch of other things. But in our last episode, actually, Jason, Peter and I were talking about the fact that, you know, Love in the Loops, the podcast we did together, was this really great paid media opportunity, an innovative way to kind of pitch stories that probably wouldn't have gotten traditional media coverage. But
definitely, because
there was this avenue that was being paid for, and two really great co-hosts.
I made the whole thing, obviously.
Pretty much.
We were able to cover this kind of, you know, news that was news, but wasn't necessarily mainstream news. So I'm excited you're here.
Well, I'm excited to be back. Thank you so much for asking me. And it's great to finally meet Peter kind of face to face, voice to voice, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We've been talking on social media for months now. So no, it's a pleasure to be here.
Nice. Okay, so we have been talking about public relations in 2021. And Jason, we used to have these conversations kind of before our podcast episodes, but the landscape has changed so much in the last year. I think changed even on hyperdrive because of the pandemic. But I think over the last decade, media has really changed and evolved. And I'd love to just put you on the spot and learn more about your story and your transformation from journalist to, you know, what I lovingly say, jack of all communications trades.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I was one of those people. Like I, have a journalism degree, from TRU. When I started the program, it was University College of the Cariboo, and the program had been around already for probably 10, 15 years by that point. And because I was able to get an internship, like I was supposed to get an internship. It's a 2-year program. Halfway through, you were supposed to get an internship at a paper and apply your trade, which you had learned so far. I wasn't able to secure that at the Kamloops Daily News because I didn't have enough experience, which was weird. And then I went and did some fill-in work at Kamloops this week. And then a mat leave came up at Kamloops Daily News, and they called me and they're like, "Do you want to do this mat leave for a year?" And so that's how I got in. And then it just so worked out that the person who I filled in for never came back. So I got the job and I kept it. And I was the first person, I think, hired at the Daily News out of school in 50 years. Like it was just a weird thing that worked out. And then I finished my degree part-time. So by the time I finished, the UCC had switched to TRU, Thompson Rivers University, right? Which was good for me because my degree suddenly had more credibility and I wanted to go anywhere else. So I did that. And I was at the Daily News for 10 years until it shut. Back in January of 2014. And in that time, the landscape changed dramatically. Like there was the internet, but there was no social media when I started. I think maybe MySpace might have kind of been a thing, and that was nothing like what you see today. And we went from being able to dedicate yourself to writing good stories, I would say, with like actual investigative journalism in the early days. And you'd have to still write. So there's a staff of maybe like 8 to 12 of us in the newsroom, if you included kind of sports and, what we called the desk, which was the layout section. So you still covered a couple beats and you still have to write, 3 or 4 stories a day, but you could spend a lot of time. If you had a good story, you could spend time on a good story.
Right.
And not have to worry about cranking out tons of copy. But by the time I was done, halved. The newsroom was cut in half. Probably by the time I was done, the sports department was the sports editor plus one person. And there was maybe 4 of us journalists plus a city editor and an editor in the news department. And I would on days write 7, 8 stories, like be full on. And the problem that I saw coming up, and it's what newspapers have struggled with since the internet really took off, was the push to go online.
Right.
And so by the time I was finished, the entirety of the day's paper that would be coming out. So if I was working Monday, Tuesday's paper was available online for free by Monday night at 6 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
And you just can't sustain that, right?
Yeah.
The paywalls weren't working anywhere. You were on Twitter. You had to spend as much time on Twitter as you were writing your story. It just became this, in my mind, untenable.
Yeah.
For someone that got into it. That wasn't what I got signed on board for. I wanted to tell stories and tell them well. And that's not what we were doing in the end. I didn't think so.
Yeah.
So that's like the biggest transition. And the job went from being stressful enough as it was to becoming like super stressful. We were all an older staff at the newspaper, at the Daily News. We were probably one of the last union papers,
Oh, wow.
which I'm pretty sure is why we shut, because we were expensive as well. And so, yeah, when we closed, that just left a huge gaping hole in the Kamloops news market. But I think it was a sign of the times, because we just learned as of last week that TRU's no longer has a journalism program. Like, it's done.
Yeah.
Wow.
They won't be taking in any more people. And that's just become a sign of the times, I think.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
Blowing Peter's mind, one thing.
Yeah, no, it really does blow my mind. Well, I mean, if it's like, that's an entire, like career,
Profession.
right?
Yeah.
Profession, right? I mean,
Gone.
sort of just disappearing, right? Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
And I've noticed in the interim, like, I mean, I went into working with Work BC for a while and everything before I started at Radio NL. There was the PR departments everywhere had become huge, right? And organizations like yourselves, and even like the school district, where when I'd cover education, and for years I could just phone up the superintendent of
Right.
the school district. Hey, Terry, what can you tell me? And he'd either talk to me or find someone who would.
Yeah.
And now there's a full PR department, right? Like the Kamloops Fire and Rescue, you'd call the battalion chief and you'd talk to him. And then it became like there'd be these different spokespeople. And that's just the way it's gone. And so I think part of it is for getting your story out there. And just like you were saying, Christina, with what we did with Love in the Loops, those who want a story to get out can tell it themselves.
Yeah.
And you don't need a traditional journalist to do it. Never mind, the whole point of journalism was to be, the fourth estate, and that we were unbiased. I think even that's changed now. Every newspaper or broadcaster is owned by some company with its own agenda and bias leaning one way or the other. So that's just completely gone. So you guys can tell the story for your clients, how they want to tell the story. The school district can deliver the message it wants to deliver, much like the government does. You know what I mean? That's just becoming the norm. And I think, sadly, there's not a need for what you'd call traditional journalists anymore, in my opinion.
Yeah. Poor grade 7 Christina, her poster board presentation on wanting to be a journalist, just in the garbage can. But it's like, to your point, it's really interesting. Like, I remember in university still going along the path, wanting to become a journalist. And then, you get to the end of that 4-year degree and you kind of, similar to you look around and you go, okay, well, there aren't really any jobs here. But at the time, there were all of these really interesting jobs on the public relations side, right? People wanting to answer the questions, but not necessarily ask the questions.
Well, it's easier to answer them. I've learned, right? Sometimes, right? Especially tough questions like that. To ask them can be a difficult task. And I did the crime beat for years, and you're talking to people who had lost a loved one to murder or an accident, you know what I mean? Or, or just witnessed something horrible. And then trying to talk to people in that moment is hard.
Yeah.
So, I get it. Now it's much easier to be on the other side of the mic, kind of thing, or just do more stories like what we did on Love in the Loops, or, just like a more of a community piece. So I kind of get it, but I think it's kind of just sad how that's gone. Like,
yeah, it is kind of sad. Yeah. And I think people are kind of missing a level of objectivity that used to exist. It's just sort of no longer there, right? Now, obviously, there's these PR departments and these people spinning up stories and sort of telling narratives and sort of, creating their own kind of narratives and this and that. And it certainly takes away any kind of, objectivity and people asking critical questions and sort of digging deeper, right? It just doesn't happen as much anymore.
Well, and I think like Donald Trump was a prime example of that. He wanted to control his own message. And now I think that led to the whole concept of like fake news. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, even if it's not fake news, it's real, but someone else can just kind of go, well, I don't believe you, so I think you're wrong. And what you're saying aren't facts. My facts are right.
Right.
You're seeing a lot more of that because there is no kind of entity in the middle ground. is calling BS on either side of the fence. And that's what traditional journalism was supposed to do, right? And now, so you've just got all these quote unquote facts being reported on either side, but there's still a bias to it. And so who do you believe? Well, you can, and with the internet and social media, whatever you want to believe can be validated in any number of ways, because whatever you search in a search engine, the algorithm picks up on that, and it's just going to keep feeding you what you want to hear.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. That's dangerous as well. And now that's look at the whole course of this pandemic, right? We've kind of made it worse. The people, they don't want to believe it, so that's all they're gonna put out there, and that's what gets fed into the algorithm and the stream. And then the people, like the actual health officers, are trying to deliver facts, but then no one believes them because it doesn't fit with their narrative, and it's just, the whole thing falls apart, I think.
Yeah.
So from where you're sitting now, are you noticing companies behaving differently? You mentioned these larger PR departments. Are they pitching new media stories still? Are they trying to get your attention on stuff, or has that changed? How is that looking from your perspective?
It still could be like some of the work I've done at NL, like filling in, like I became like the sort of like, not the program guy, but I'd book interviews for other shows when I'd be there, even try to track down people for the shows that I was hosting and filling in on. And yeah, there is no shortage of stuff being thrown at you, right? Like none at all. So that's definitely where things are at. And I think even as a journalist, because there is so few of you, like the serious journalists that are working, and you're so busy and you've got to fill now. It's not just like, the next day's paper, like it's because it's online, you're filling a 24-hour news cycle. You're just going to grab what people send your way. So I don't always think the critical questions are being asked, just because there's this crush of information and you've got to fill so much space.
Do you think part of it, I think back even like 5 years ago when I was kind of more heavily oil and gas, and it was always the relationship, right? Like, what journalist do I know? Who can I get to write what I think will hopefully be an unbiased story about whatever catastrophe I'm trying to message on? And it was, similar to you from the journalist perspective. You could call Buddy and he'd answer and there'd be no PR team. I felt like I had a group of journalists that I could call and go, okay, let's meet, have a beer, and I can tell you something and we can try to work something out. Do you think that still exists, or is that whole, because everyone is so overwhelmed, it's just, okay, what's at the top of the inbox? Or like, does that relationship piece matter anymore?
I think in certain regards it does, but I like, because I haven't been in mainstream media like full on for the last few years, but I mean, there's definitely people that I could call upon who I knew from before, that I knew I could get accurate information. Like say when I was filling in NL, I knew that I could get that. So I think if you've got that relationship, it's never going to go away. And I think any journalist or even PR person worth their salt will always try to maintain that.
Yeah.
But I think it's harder to do now. If you were someone just starting out in journalism or PR, to find that person, I think would be tough.
Yeah. I think that's very valid.
Yeah. I think it would be really, really hard. And I mean, if you're someone like a young reporter trying to get on the crime beat, trying to get anything out of the cops, good luck. Like, it's just not going to happen anymore. I think there's been so much bad press and just mistakes made on the fact of police agencies everywhere that that's just gone.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I think it's a lot harder to do that, as with anything else. It's just a lot harder to make that one-on-one personal connection. Right. I'm sure post-pandemic it might even be harder.
Yeah.
Because people who don't want to have that, they just can hide behind their wall, their email wall or their Zoom wall. Right. I think
no
that's
comment.
just the way things are going. Right. Exactly. Just block it out or unplug. So
Jason, what are you up to now? How did you pivot that career, I guess, from, being on multiple beats and going through kind of a newspaper shutting itself down? Where'd you go? What are you doing? How are you, still being a journalist without being a journalist?
I switched it up. Like, I ended up going into employment services of all things for quite a few years. But I had always, for 10 years, 11 years now, back in 2010, I started doing a podcast, like a movie podcast. And that kind of stayed even when I left the newspaper, my constant little form of still being a journalist, right? More of an entertainment journalist, but still doing that. But because I kept doing that, and I had connections at Radio NL, when Radio NL was bought by Stingray in 2018, and they went from being a music station, it's like suddenly they were told overnight, you're talk radio 24/7. And you got to have a morning news show that's like 3 hours long and kind of thing. They wanted to have entertainment and they wanted it to be local. So my co-host Sean and I were approached about doing a segment for them. And because I did that with, Howie Reimer, who's the program director there and the morning show host, that almost became my back into sort of media on any kind of basis. And because that went well, it morphed into being a primetime show. And then I filled in for people on Radio NL. And then that, of course, led to opportunities to do like Love in the Loops and a few other programs there at Radio NL, which I don't know what's going to be going on because they're in such a state of flux, just because like we all are.
Yeah.
But that was how I kind of got back into that and continue to do, programming that way. And then my writing side of it, I just ended up writing a book with a friend of mine who's a ghost hunter, and he's been doing it for 27 years all over the world. And his story is very interesting, and it made for a good book. So I interviewed him, and that book's come out at the end of the year, and it's led to a contract, write 2 more books over the course of this year that are still in that same realm. So it's not like, I wouldn't call it serious journalism, but it's still research and interviewing and talking to people and writing, which I love to do. So it's kept that going. And yeah, and I'm now just still working on other projects. Someone else, wants to, a fitness guy, James Sutherland, who was on Love in the Loops one,
Oh, yeah.
he wants to start his own fitness show. So now I'm helping him do that. And that's just sort of, but I'm kind of like what you guys are doing. I've not really employed by any one media company. I'm doing my own thing.
Yeah.
Right.
And which has been great to transition into doing that. But I think that's, for a lot of people, that's kind of how you got to do it now. Like,
Yeah.
there's no security anywhere, I don't think, in any form of media unless it's your own
Right.
entity that you're doing. I don't think. I mean, I think, every company wants a PR branch, but I think if they're going to cut, that's also the first place that they're going to cut, right?
Yeah.
No,
it's not making the money.
It's true.
Right.
I remember, like, I got out of corporate Calgary 2015, right before that downturn.
Mhm.
And I remember feeling so lucky that I made the decision to leave, because one of the first interview questions when I wasn't sure I wanted to go off and do something on my own was always, oh, like, I see that you have this company and you're consulting. Like, is that a real thing? Or, is that just like we're laid off and that's the guise of what you're doing now? And I was like, no, this is a real thing. I'm really trying to do something over here. Yeah, it's interesting. It's definitely the way the world's going. And Peter, you and I often talk about the changing landscape of every occupation in terms of consultants are eventually going to rule the day, right? Like, there's something about this working from home is absolutely acceptable now. And so it's given the consultant even more legitimacy and juggling multiple files and multiple commitments. And yeah.
Yeah, and I think to Jason's point, it gives you better job security. It gives you better, it's sort of, one of my favorite books is called Anti-Fragile, and he talks about the story about the turkey, and the turkey, gets fed by the farmer every single day of his life until the day, he doesn't, and his head gets chopped off, right? And, it's like, don't be a turkey, right? and that story, he talks about that story in context of being an employee versus being, somebody that's sort of self-employed and has multiple contracts and is anti-fragile, right? And so it makes sense that that's the direction the world's going. Don't be a turkey.
I agree, and I think this pandemic has sort of, like, we've seen that. I love to bring up the movie analogy because movie theaters are in such a bad place and streaming has taken over, and some big movie like Godzilla versus Kong can come out and do really well in the theater, but still do really well at home. And I think that just gives, and I think studios have wanted that control. Now they've got it. They can say that. They create their own streaming service. They can put their product out however they see fit. They're not relying on one thing. And I think we as workers need that. And I think, because like Christina's saying, it's so much more acceptable now to work from home, and companies are just telling people, yeah, don't come back. Like, just keep working from home, be productive.
Yeah.
I think this has sort of just pushed that a lot faster. What might have taken, 20 to 50 years has been done in like a couple.
Yeah.
I think we'll still see that. Right. And I hope it gives people that freedom to kind of do that. If you love media and you're creative and you got a good network, you can make it work for yourself. And I've made it work for myself, and it's scary.
Sure.
Right. And but I don't think there's such a thing as job security at any job where you're an employee anymore.
No, there isn't. Yeah. Well, and the interesting, that sort of kind of two things that are going on there is that, like, at the same time as the traditional media sort of channels are sort of struggling and dying, there's a growing need and demand for media, like generally, in a general sense, right? So companies need to tell their own stories. There's bloggers, vloggers, podcast. I mean, there's just, this explosion. And so I think from the positive side, from a media perspective, or a person with an interest in media, writing, communications, is that there's more opportunity than ever. But you just have to, it's just a different approach, and you have to, think differently about it, right? It's, not your traditional job. It's more of that kind of gig economy type situation. But, there's the opportunity to pursue your passions and go in all kinds of directions, and, decide you don't want to do this anymore, try that, right? So, I mean, I think it's net positive, but obviously challenging and painful at the same time.
Well, and I think is what you're saying too. You put out the fact too, Peter, that you got to got to be able to do everything.
Yeah.
And I think that because if you're going to do it yourself, you have to. You got to be able to write. You got to do video. You got to edit. You got to music is great if you can find it, or know someone who can do it for you, because there's that expectation now. You're not just writing a story. You've got to present it, and I think that was where traditional media was going. Like by the end, like we had photographers, sure, but if I could go out and shoot my own pictures, they prefer that.
Right.
You know what I mean? And
right.
edit the picture down. Everything took longer and then please tweet it while you're out there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's just like, holy cow. But it's a good skill set to have had, because it's saving my butt right now.
Totally.
Well, I even think about you and I, Jason, when it was like we would tape in studio, and then the pandemic hit, and essentially we were just told, we'll figure out how to do this and make it work, right? And you became a podcast editor overnight. I had to figure out the Zoom thing, and we kept the show going. But it was on us.
And it was, and I mean, and would we, if Love in the Loops had continued, would we have just kept doing it this way? Because it's easier than flying you out, right, for like a couple of days, and then you got to book studio time, and it just made things simpler. We just did it ourselves, and you can do it yourself, right? And I think it's great that the technology has made the leaps too, like, because Zoom has been an amazing tool. It's some of the best. I do all my interviews from the basement now over Zoom.
Yeah.
It sounds good. I can look at the person instead of trying to do it on the phone, right? It just it's crazy.
It works, right?
Yeah.
Well, on that note, thanks for joining us on Zoom, Jason.
You're very welcome, guys. It's been good to be here.
I'll say one thing in closing. I haven't thought about my MySpace page in decades. But I'm thinking about it now, and I remember a few good gems on that. If there's anything I could go back and screenshot, it would have been that, just to show my kids what MySpace was all about.
Nice.
Right? People don't even know what it is now. You don't even, I just knew it because I read it somewhere the other day. Yeah, right, that thing.
Yeah, that was something. That was a thing.
It was a thing for like a year, maybe, right?
Yeah.
And Facebook changed it completely.
There you go.
So that's the norm.
Yeah,
totally.
It's true. Well, if I'm just going to encourage our listeners, if you need someone who's really cool, really innovative in a communication space when it comes to broadcasting and podcasting and book writing now.
I'm also working on a book, so I might be in touch, actually.
Yeah, absolutely, man. That would be great.
There you go. We'll throw all your handles and all the places to find you in the episode brief. But Jason, thank you. It was so awesome to hear your story once again.
Thank you so much, guys. It's been great to be on.
Perfect. So listeners, you can follow along in the podcast on iTunes and Spreaker and Spotify, and of course, CIPR Comms on all your favorite social media channels. Thank you, and we will talk to you again soon.